Dawn rose late over Iwo Jima on February 26, 1945, and the Marines stepping onto the black sand expected another deadly fight. But one man carried a weapon everyone hated: the 20-pound Browning automatic rifle, too heavy, too slow. The worst gun to bring into a Pacific firefight, his instructors said. But in the next few hours, Private Wilson Watson would do something no one expected. He would use that same bad weapon to fight alone against dozens of enemy soldiers and win. The Marines thought the BAR held them back. Watson proved it could change a battle. Before the day was over, he would rewrite the rules of close-range combat. Subscribe for more World War II stories. Private Wilson Watson did not feel lucky when the Browning automatic rifle was handed to him. Most Marines hoped to avoid it. At around 20 pounds loaded, the bar was heavy, long, and tiring to carry. It was called a walking machine gun, but in the Pacific, where men sprinted, crawled, and climbed over brutal ground, it felt more like a punishment than a weapon. Watson had trained with the bar for months, from Paris Island to Camp Pendleton. Every mile of marching, every drill, reminded him just how much extra weight he was dragging compared to the men with M1 Garands. They carried light rifles and ammo clips that slipped easily into their belts. He lugged a thick metal beast, long magazines, and the constant fear of running dry at the wrong moment. On paper, the bar sounded impressive. It fired the same .30-06 round as the Garand. It could shoot in full automatic at several hundred rounds per minute. Its effective range was listed at 500 to 600 yards. But those numbers hid the harsh truth. Each magazine held only 20 rounds. At full auto, that meant less than 2 seconds of continuous fire before the gun ran empty under fire. Reloading took precious time. 8 to 10 seconds with shaking hands felt like forever when bullets were cracking overhead. The gun also came with a bipod, meant to turn it into a stable support weapon. In real life, that bipod snagged on roots, coral, gear straps, and anything else it could catch. Many Marines simply removed it. They would rather shoulder the gun, tuck it into their bodies, and hope their own strength could steady the barrel. Watson grew up in rural Alabama. He had learned to hunt with a bolt-action rifle, where every shot mattered, and every wasted round meant less food. His father taught him to be patient, to breathe, to line up the sights, and only fire when he knew he could hit. To him, spray and pray was just bad shooting. The bar felt like the opposite of everything he respected in a gun: loud, hungry for ammo, built for bursts instead of precision. Now, as he crouched in a crowded landing craft heading toward Iwo Jima's black beach, the bar rested on his lap like a steel anchor. He knew what the manual said. He was the squad's main source of automatic fire, the backbone of their attack. But he also knew what every Marine joked in private, that the bar man was the slowest, heaviest target on the field. As the volcanic island rose in front of him, Watson wondered which version would turn out to be true. Before the Marines ever touched the sand of Iwo Jima, they knew this island would not be like any other. For 3 years, they had fought across the Pacific, Tarawa, Saipan, Guam, and each battle had been brutal in its own way. But Iwo Jima was different. It was a true fortress, built with care, patience, and one clear purpose: to kill anyone who tried to take it. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, the Japanese commander, had studied every American move since the start of the war. He knew the Marines depended on fast attacks supported by naval guns and aircraft. He knew they rushed off the beach quickly to avoid being trapped. And he knew exactly how to break that rhythm. Instead of lining troops along the shore, Kuribayashi ordered something unheard of in earlier island battles. No one would defend the beach. For 8 long months, his men carved the island into a maze. Over 11 miles of tunnels wound beneath the ground, connecting bunkers, caves, artillery chambers, and machine gun nests. The steep hills, ridges, and cliffs were designed to force American troops into kill zones. Every likely hiding spot, every boulder, crater, ditch, and slope had already been measured and marked for mortar and artillery fire. Nothing was accidental. Everything was planned. Naval gunfire pounded Iwo Jima for days before the landings, but the Marines were stunned to learn that most of the Japanese survived underground. The volcanic rock swallowed the blasts. Shells that would have torn apart a normal bunker barely scratched Kuribayashi's network. The island looked destroyed, but beneath the surface, the defenders waited unharmed. Watson's unit had been briefed on Hill 203, one of the most dangerous positions in the southern part of the island. Photos showed a twisted landscape of black ash, sharp rocks, and small ridges that could hide entire platoons. In reality, it was worse. Hill 203 wasn't just high ground. It was a command point for multiple firing positions. Machine guns could hit Marines from above, from the sides, and from hidden caves they couldn't see until it was too late. As Watson's landing craft neared shore, the silence felt wrong. There were no machine gun bursts, no mortar plumes, no sudden explosions, just the distant crash of waves and the low rumble of Marines shouting commands. It looked like an easy landing, like maybe the bombardment worked. But the briefings had warned them. When the Japanese finally opened fire, it would be all at once. All guns, all positions, absolute chaos. Watson tightened his grip on the BAR. The island in front of him was quiet only because the defenders wanted it that way. They were counting boats, watching movements, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The Marines weren't just landing on an island, they were stepping straight into a trap, one built by a commander who had prepared for them better than anyone they had ever faced. The silence on Iwo Jima lasted only 47 minutes. That was the trap. The Marines pushed inland across the black sand, struggling through ground so soft it swallowed their boots. Watson's bar dug into his shoulder with every step. Men around him began to relax just a little. No gunfire, no enemy movement, no resistance. Some even thought maybe, just maybe, the bombardment had wiped out the defenders. Then, the world exploded. The first mortar round hit the beach with a violent crack that shook the ground. Another followed. Then another. Within seconds, dozens of explosions tore through the Marines packed tightly together. It felt as if the entire island woke up at once. Hidden guns, silent since sunrise, now opened with perfect timing. Machine gun fire poured from caves that no one had seen. Snipers fired from holes no bigger than a helmet. Bunkers that looked destroyed suddenly lit up with bright muzzle flashes. Kuribayashi's plan hit full force. Watson and his squad were moving nearly 300 yards inland when the hillside in front of them burst into life. Long, thin streams of tracer rounds sliced the air inches above the ash-covered ground. Marines dove for cover, but everywhere they scrambled, bursts of fire followed them. What the men didn't know, and what the Japanese had prepared for months in advance, was that every inch of the approach had been pre-sighted, for fire mortars landed exactly where Marines naturally tried to hide. Machine guns swept the paths Marines instinctively used to advance. It was a battlefield designed to punish every normal infantry instinct. Watson dropped flat and swung the bar forward. He tried to fire from a stable prone position like he had practiced in training, but the moment he started firing, enemy mortars shifted onto him. 3 shells slammed into the ground around him, showering him with hot volcanic grit. He was forced to roll away before he could even see if his shots hit anything. The Marines were fighting shadows. The Japanese opened fire only for a split second, long enough to hit a target, then slipped back into tunnels where no one could shoot them. Riflemen tried firing at muzzle flashes, but by the time they aimed, the enemy was gone. The sound of Japanese machine guns filled the air, a fast, buzzing rhythm that cut through the ash like a saw blade. Sergeant McMahon yelled for the squad to regroup in a shallow depression ahead. Men sprinted and dove in, sliding on the loose sand. For a moment, it seemed safer, until mortars bracketing their position proved that even this small pit had already been mapped by the enemy. Watson watched Marines with Garands try to pin down the machine gun nests, but long-range accuracy meant nothing when the enemy showed themselves for only a heartbeat. Even perfect riflemen were helpless when the target vanished before the bullet reached the mark. That was the moment Watson realized something that changed everything. The BAR could not be used the way the manual said. Not here. Not in this kind of fight. If he stayed still, he would be buried by mortars. If he fired slowly, he would be outgunned. If he followed the rules, he would die. The trap had sprung, but Watson was about to break it by refusing to fight the way the Marines had been taught. Pinned in the volcanic ash, Watson knew he had only seconds to act. 50 yards ahead, a Japanese machine gun burst open from a cave mouth, its tracers sweeping across the Marines like a blade. Every time one of his squad mates tried to lift their head, bullets snapped past their helmets. Watson tried what the manual told him to do: set the bipod, lie prone, and fire carefully. But the moment he steadied the bar and fired his first shots, a mortar round slammed into the ground so close it knocked the wind out of him. Another round followed. Then another. The enemy wasn't aiming at the squad. They were aiming at him. The BAR man was always the biggest target. Watson rolled through the ash, coughing and choking on sulfur-filled dust, and he understood the awful truth. If he stayed still, he would die. The machine gun nest wasn't going to wait for him to set up a perfect firing position. The mortars weren't going to give him time to adjust his aim. Everything about this fight was designed to kill men who stopped moving. So Watson did the one thing the manuals never taught. He stood up. He rose from the ground, heavy bar in hand, and started moving directly toward the enemy cave. The gun's weight, which had always felt like a curse, now steadied his aim as he fired short, sharp bursts while advancing. The recoil pressed the weapon into his shoulder with predictable force. Each step dug into the soft sand, kicking up black grit as he pushed forward. The Japanese machine gun crew froze for a moment. They weren't trained for this. American Marines were supposed to find cover, regroup, and advance in slow, careful bounds, not charge a bunker in full daylight, wielding automatic fire. Watson kept firing, not in wild sprays, but in controlled bursts. The BAR barked loudly, echoing off the ridge. The tracers from the cave shifted desperately toward him, but Watson kept moving. 20 yards, 15, 10. He closed the distance so fast the enemy barely had time to react. At point-blank range, Watson unleashed the rest of his magazine into the cave mouth. The gunfire echoed like thunder inside the tight chamber, tearing through the crew before they could retreat into the tunnel. In seconds, the machine gun went silent. Behind him, the Marines who had been pinned down stared in disbelief. One man, lugging the worst gun in the unit, had just taken out a fortified machine gun nest alone. But something bigger had happened. Watson realized the BAR wasn't a problem. It was the solution. He now understood the weapon in a way few Marines ever had. The BAR was not meant to be fired like a rifle. It wasn't a stationary support gun, it was a close assault weapon, made for aggressive movement, meant to overpower defenders in the brief seconds they revealed themselves. Watson had stopped fighting by the book, and now, for the first time since landing on the island, he felt the tide shift. The battle around him was still raging, but he had found the one truth no doctrine had taught. On Iwo Jima, survival belonged to the Marine who broke the rules first. Watson's charge changed the mood of the entire squad. Moments earlier, Marines were pinned flat, afraid to lift their heads. Now they watched a single bar man crush a position that had held up an entire platoon. The message was clear. Movement, speed, and violence worked better here than anything the training books had promised. Sergeant McMahon shouted for the squad to push forward, and the men began moving from crater to crater, using broken ridges as cover. But no one moved like Watson. He had found something new, a rhythm that let him advance while firing short, controlled bursts. The bar's heavy frame steadied each shot, and the 30-06 rounds tore into cave mouths before the enemy could duck back inside. Each time a Japanese defender exposed himself, Watson snapped the gun toward the opening and fired a burst that forced them deeper into their tunnels. They were trained for long-range fights, not a Marine who closed the gap so fast their firing angles became useless. The Marines around him noticed the change too. Instead of waiting for machine gun teams to show themselves, they pressed forward behind Watson, letting his aggressive fire pull the enemy's focus. Riflemen, who normally depended on long-range shots, now used the terrain to creep closer, tossing grenades into holes and clearing small caves before the defenders could recover. But Watson paid a price. He burned through magazines fast, 20 rounds gone in seconds. After each burst, he felt the weight of his ammo belt lighten. By the time they reached the lower edge of Hill 203, he had already used several magazines. Only 10 remained. Every Marine knew that bar ammo was life running dry, meant becoming just another rifleman with a heavy gun he couldn't use. Still, Watson didn't slow down. He pushed toward the hill with purpose. The Japanese had built every slope, every dip, and every outcropping to funnel Marines into kill zones. But Watson treated the terrain like a moving maze, slipping between boulders, firing at cave mouths, and advancing whenever he heard a gap in enemy fire. The Marines finally reached the base of Hill 203, sweating, exhausted, and shaken. Watson wiped soot and grit from his face. The climb ahead was steep and deadly, but the squad had survived the first gauntlet. What none of them knew was that the Japanese hadn't been pushed back. They had simply pulled the Marines deeper into the trap. And at the top of Hill 203, an entirely different nightmare was waiting for them. The climb up Hill 203 was slow and dangerous. The ground shifted under every step, sliding like loose powder. Watson stayed low, moving between jagged rocks as his squad pushed upward. For a moment, the firing eased, and it almost felt like the enemy had pulled back. But that feeling lasted only seconds. At 11:47 a.m., a sudden mortar landed behind Watson with a sharp crack that echoed across the hillside. The blast threw dirt, ash, and metal fragments into the air. Corporal Henderson, only a few feet away, was killed instantly. 2 other Marines were wounded so badly they could no longer move. But the worst part wasn't the casualties. It was the wire. The blast had shredded the communication line that connected the platoon to battalion headquarters. Just like that, they were cut off. More mortars rained down, scattering the remaining Marines across a wide stretch of broken terrain. Each man dove into the nearest hole or crack in the rock, trying to escape the constant shelling. When the barrage finally ended, A strange quiet settled across Hill 203. No voices, no orders, no sense of where anyone else had landed. Watson slowly lifted his head. The hillside looked wrong. Marines who had been next to him minutes ago were now spread out, trapped behind ridges and depressions too dangerous to cross. He tried to wave for McMahon, but the sergeant was nowhere in sight. Through the sulfur haze, Watson spotted movement. Japanese infantry slipping back into bunkers and caves. The Marines thought they had cleared. They weren't retreating. They were resetting the trap. He counted at least 7 firing points positioned in a half circle around him. Each one overlooked the path the Marines had climbed. Each one had tunnels connecting it to several others. The enemy could shift soldiers easily without exposing themselves. Watson realized they weren't hunting one Marine. They were preparing to crush the entire scattered platoon. He checked his ammo. 10 magazines left. 200 rounds. Enough for only a few minutes of hard fighting. The reality hit him with full weight. He was alone on the hill. No radio, no squad. No way to call for help. The Japanese believed they had isolated a weak point in the Marine line. One exhausted BAR man, wounded or shaken, waiting to be finished off. But Watson wasn't thinking about surrender or escape. He tightened his grip on the BAR. If they wanted the hill, they would have to take it from him. The hillside stayed quiet for almost a full minute. Then Watson saw them. A Japanese squad, 8 men, moved calmly up the slope toward him, rifles held low, as if they truly believed the Marine on the hill was already dead. They walked with slow, steady steps, checking bodies and scanning the rocks for survivors. Watson waited until they were within 40 yards. Then he fired the first burst. The bar roared, sending a tight line of 30-06 rounds straight through the squad before they even had time to react. 2 men fell instantly. Another tried to dive behind a rock, but Watson's second burst caught him mid-jump. Within seconds, all 8 soldiers were down. The sudden violence echoed across the ridge, and the entire valley seemed to freeze. The Japanese now knew he was alive. A shout came from farther up the hill. 2 more squads appeared, fanning out to flank him. They moved faster this time, using shadows and rocks for cover. The enemy was confident in their numbers. They believed Watson would run out of ammo before he could stop them. Watson did not wait for them to finish spreading out. He rose from his position and began moving downhill, firing short bursts and shifting left and right to avoid becoming an easy target. Dust and ash burst around his boots as rifle rounds cracked into the ground. A sniper's shot grazed his shoulder, spinning him halfway around, but he caught himself and kept firing. The bar shook in his hands, but the weight helped steady each burst. Every time the enemy popped up, Watson sent a line of fire that forced them back into the rocks. He moved like a man who refused to die in one place. The Japanese could not predict where he would pop up next. A grenade landed near his feet. Watson dove behind a stone ledge, the blast ripping into the rock and showering him with sharp fragments. He pushed himself up, panting hard, and fired again. 1 enemy soldier dropped. Another tried to advance and fell seconds later. The squads pulled back to regroup, shocked that 1 Marine had stopped 2 waves alone. Watson's chest heaved, and sweat stung his eyes, but his resolve only hardened. They wanted the hill. He wasn't giving it to them. The ridge fell quiet again, but Watson knew it was not over. He had only 1 full magazine left, 20 rounds, enough for a single minute of steady fire. As he reloaded, he spotted movement across the slope, far more than before. More than 2 squads, more than a dozen men. Shadows shifted across rocks and crater edges. Soon, he realized the truth. An entire Japanese platoon was coming for him, close to 40 soldiers, moving in a wide arc to crush the lone Marine on the hill. Watson felt the weight of the last magazine settle into the bar. There was no retreat, no backup, no radio. Just him, the gun everyone hated, and the ridge he refused to give up. He moved to higher ground and took a long breath. When the first enemy soldier stepped into view, Watson fired a short burst, then another, then another. He did not waste a single round. Each burst was aimed. Each movement was quick and sharp. The Japanese tried forcing him into a corner with rifle fire and grenades, but Watson used every rock and dip in the ground to stay alive. He shifted positions so fast, the enemy could not track him. His last magazine drained fast, each burst punching into the advancing line. 3 minutes later, his final shot echoed across the ridge. Then, silence. When the smoke lifted, the hillside was covered in bodies. Later counts estimated nearly 60 Japanese soldiers had been stopped by one Marine with one bar. Watson sat down, shaking, the empty weapon in his lap. Blood ran down his shoulder, and the ash around him was torn by bombs and bullets. He had nothing left to fire, nothing left to give. When Marines finally reached him, they found him barely conscious, but alive. Surgeons saved his arm and leg. Though he never returned to combat, his actions on Hill 203 spread through the Corps like wildfire. Officers studied how he fought, how he moved, how he fired, how he used the bar not as a slow, defensive weapon, but as a fast, aggressive tool. Watson showed the Marines that the BAR was not a burden. It was a shock weapon, a breaker of strong points, a tool for the man who dared to push forward when everyone else pulled back. Wilson Watson received the Medal of Honor, but he never spoke much about that day. He always said he just did what needed to be done. But the men who survived because of him told a different truth. On that hill, Watson didn't just save Marines. He changed how Marines fought.